The highly anticipated report on rejuvenating European competitiveness in the face of shifting geopolitical and geo-economic landscape was released last week on September 9th. This was authored by Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi was the former president of the European Central Bank and the former prime minister of Italy. And this report aims to steer the European project to regain its competitive edge in a rather volatile world. In a nutshell, it recommends a tightly coordinated industrial policy with mammoth investments to the tune of about 750 to 800 billion euros every year. Now, securing such a massive investment is challenging, especially when major European economies are already grappling with high debt levels, like, for example, France's historic debt and Germany's ongoing financial difficulties, as you may be reading in the news. Now, translating these ambitious ideas that the Draghi report comes out with into action will really be the real test. So, what is this Draghi effect? The report has said what the EU needs to hear, but it remains tad radical to be implemented. For instance, Draghi's call to enable such investments is through pushing the block on joint borrowing for joint investment projects, something that the member states and especially the largest economies like Germany have resisted. The tone and tenor of the report is quite simple. If the EU project has to sustain, it has to act and speedily so, not at the member state level, but at the EU wide level. But the reality on the ground is different. Member states have competing interests and views and are used to exist in a state of permanent negotiation. They take time and they take more time and they take yet more time to put the act together. So, to identify common goals and enabling frameworks is not enough unless there is political will and financial capacity to perform within stipulated time. The report scores an important point where it shows that decision making in the EU should create more space for majority rather than consensus only, to allow for those member states that wish to move faster than others. Now, whether this weakens or strengthens the EU fabric can be up for debate, but resilience per se is a necessity than a luxury right now. Now, let me explain a bit on how the EU has been evolving through its transformative agendas. The European project is a dynamic entity, continuously evolving. Prior to the war, the EU's primary focus was the green transition, with ambitious plans to make renewable energy the cornerstone of its industries. Now, this drive was also reflected in the Green Party's strong electoral performance. Just before the war in Ukraine began, the Greens actually achieved notable electoral success in Germany and formed a coalition with Chancellor Olaf Scholz's SPD in 2021. However, the war in Ukraine upended those aspirations in more ways than one. Europe had to pivot away from cheap Russian energy, which was delivered through Soviet era pipelines, and instead invest heavily in LNG terminals to import liquefied natural gas from alternative sources such as Qatar, the US, and Norway. Germany alone invested approximately the most in LNG terminals in Europe. Additionally, the war prompted a debate over the role of nuclear energy. Countries like France, which relies quite heavily on nuclear power with over 50 reactors, now these countries have different views from countries like Germany that remain opposed to nuclear energy. As Russia's war in Ukraine has intensified, Europe has had to pause its renewable energy goals and revert to coal as Russian gas supplies were cut off in anticipation of Brussels banning it, which eventually happened anyway. So for now, Europe still gets about 15% of its gas from Russia, which of course is a sharp decline from its 40% dependence on Moscow when the war had started. Now, this 15% gas is mainly exported to landlocked European countries in primarily Central Europe that have no coastline for getting LNG terminals. In a latest, Ukraine's control of Suja in Russia's Kursk region has disrupted supplies for Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia, and this situation could get worse depending upon what the situation on the battlefront is. But the cost of diversifying away from Russia's cheap gas has been huge. Unsurprisingly, the Draghi report unambiguously calls nuclear energy as an essential component for decarbonization, if that has to happen at all. And that brings me to the situation in Europe today, where it's facing a three pronged trilemma. You see, before the war, Europe was already grappling with unfair trade practices by China and its overcapacity in critical sectors. The discourse on de risking from China had started to take shape as Beijing's unfair trade practices with overflowing subsidies were affecting European businesses and competitiveness. Now, this growing concern had led Brussels to label China, if you remember, as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, and this came in 2019. So by 2022, Europe faced the dual challenges of countering Russia's energy weaponization and addressing unfair trade practices by China. Amid these issues, there emerged a third existential crisis, which was building a new security architecture as the previous one was shredded to pieces. And this happened, of course, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the bloc, that is the EU, has had to support Ukraine and bolster its own security as the epoch of conventional war has returned. The bloc confronts a trilemma: dual challenges of diversifying away from Russian energy and choosing green transition, mitigating risks associated with China's trade practices, and then finally bolster its own security. And 3 years on, the situation remains grim. The positive news is that Europe recognizes the pivotal moment it is facing. You know, both member states and Brussels are engaged in discussions to reassess and strengthen their resilience. However, challenges such as war fatigue, insufficient investments and innovation, high social spending, a sluggish global economy, and overall global unpredictability have impacted the world at large, including Europe. Then there are also differing views on how to tackle the Ukraine war. You know, the EU remains committed to Trump proofing the European security apparatus. And I have written about that. You can go back and read what I mean when I say Trump proofing. But the impact of these initiatives will be visible only towards the end of this decade, which means towards the end of 2030, if at all. Now, on the one hand, there is noticeable shift in European attitudes to lift red lines on the use of Western weapons for Ukraine. But on the other, there are voices like Viktor Orban's in Hungary that remain defiant on Ukraine. Now, the thing to understand here is that while Hungary by itself cannot block the EU's decisions on Ukraine, as was shown by its sidelining in February 2024 when the EU was trying to pass this aid package for Ukraine and Hungary was trying to block it. But what that experience showed that Hungary or anybody like Hungary can delay the decision, which is ultimately going to add to the overall strategic anxiety of Brussels because time is a crucial factor there. The rise of the far right across European spectrum, which has so far remained divided in its approach to Ukraine, could also consolidate. And this could be contrary to Brussels' view right now. So, what does all this mean for India? I would say it's about time we create new strategic gateways for India into Europe. How do we do that? Let me explain. From India's perspective, at least two recommendations in the Mario Draghi's report are relevant. The first is that the report highlights that in the case of developing skills and innovation, several European firms cannot find employees with the right skills. Now, this is certainly good news for New Delhi, with an ample and skilled labor force ready for entering the European ecosystem through strategic gateways. You know, the Indian side should double down its ongoing effort to engage the European theatre, which I think is a commendable feat of the Modi government anyway. New Delhi must look at ways to connect its market and services with not only Western but also Central and East European economies and join their multimodal connectivity projects without really waiting solely on the IMEC. Peace in West Asia, even if it were to resume, will remain fragile, and only time can tell when the IMEC will be operational. However, Indian investors must not be holding back from investing in ports such as Marseille in France, Trieste in Italy, and Thessaloniki in Greece, just to name a few. Secondly, the report has quite realistically shown the limitations of European green transition goals in coordinating a more effective industrial policy. This could reflect in a more practical approach towards its long negotiated trade agreements with developing countries like India and Indonesia. Earlier this year, India has signed its first free trade agreement with the non EU countries, that is, the four EFTA countries, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. These are the EFTA countries. While trade negotiations with the UK are close to getting finalized, the one with the EU have hit a roadblock over conditions laid out in the European Green Deal, especially pertaining to what is known as CBAM or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. With the EU reviewing its green agenda, it could be a good time to build resilience in the bloc's FTAs in a win win for all parties. The Draghi report, at best, serves as a reference point for the new commission set to come in action very soon, maybe towards the end of this year. The next 5 years, with a second term for Ursula von der Leyen at the helm, will decide the future course of the European project with an expanded role and returns for New Delhi's engagement with the European theatre. Now, whether the EU is able to implement some recommendations of the Draghi report or whether the European project is headed for more existential challenges, I will be soon to discuss that. Stay tuned.